Hello, all, and now we are going to start discussions on Michel Foucault on the channel. And I think it would be interesting to perhaps move away now from Gilles Deleuze and his works and see how they really complement each other with Foucault being focused on power, of course, and Deleuze really being a philosophy of desire. And this is, of course, parsing through, how Deleuze actually saw their relationship itself in his own comments. There's also a interesting work that we may incorporate here later on with postscripts and societies of control between the two of them. And Deleuze actually also wrote a sort of a post work after Foucault had died, in a sort of tribute, if you will. Deleuze really actually has these very concise books about other philosophers, even though his own philosophy is quite nebulous in a lot of ways. So it's kind of interesting to actually see that. But Foucault, as we're going to get into, really is an analysis of power. He is building on a lot of different thinkers in the 20th century and even prior to that to synthesize and in a sort of analysis of everything, as Marx actually said as an ambition. And so, what that really means, without sugarcoating it, is, terms and concepts, especially in our everyday lives, have a much more rich and historical contingency and genealogy to these things that I think Foucault lends us to consider with his methods and his historicism. One of the interesting things to contrast between these two thinkers here is, Deleuze is, of course, the great metaphysician of the late 20th century and really postmodern thought in general. And Foucault steps in really with this, power analysis and looking at these institutions and how, they affect, the Deleuzian desire, the social assemblages, if you will, or the relationships between aggregates or these sort of narratives, if you will, and of course in a lot of ways to just pick them apart for the ambition of unfettered desire. And so this introduction and preface shows that the Whig view of progress is really quite arbitrary, and there lays way towards this more elaborate government mentality. Really, we could see this method as a sort of archaeology of these norms, these social constructions, as he'd put it. And so Foucault is building an understanding in postmodernity of what the concept or the relationship of knowledge is to power, and henceforth the title of this video. And so in his later works, of course, in History of Sexuality, there's sexuality and its desire, and so he's focusing on these things such as punishment and discipline, sexuality, even desire to some extent, but of course the focal point really is power. And so these things that are just taken for granted as these concepts that have always been this way actually has a rich construction and genealogy to it. And so we could split Foucault into these different ambitions in his life and in his works. And so his early works that we're going to really focus on towards the end of this introduction here is really about epistemology and knowledge and how it's formed. And you can see that really expressed in the the history of madness and the birth of the clinic. But of course, the main work for his epistemology is the order of things, even though it's quite difficult. And so Foucault, of course, is going to be very critical of rationality and these meta narratives, or in other words, this overriding thesis or story that compiles together knowledge, morality, ethical judgments. One of the things with Foucault, of course, is he takes, whether you agree with him or not, one of the things he does is to take insights and say, well, and really just take them to the radical extreme, which of course is characteristic of the French postmodernists in general, or really just all of continental philosophy, and to some degree in their historical ambitions. And so Foucault offers this insight towards how he looks at structuralism, because of course he's a post-structuralist. And so in the abolishing and creation of these structure theories, you really have the abolition of this the freedom and really man, or even being, as we'll get into, the notion that we're just these free active agents, of course, doesn't hold up if you have a structuralist analysis of all of human history. And so that's something to perhaps consider in the back of your mind when dealing with Foucault and these main ideas and concepts in these works here. But to briefly introduce some of these works here, his History of Madness really is an examination of the treatment of human beings across Western Europe, and our understanding of insanity and how it's shifted. Madness for Foucault essentially is a social construction meant to coerce. And so these understandings of what is madness shifts from generation to generation. He would of course argue that it's in an arbitrary way. And so this, of course, follows into the practices of the clinician. In some respects, I think you could say, he's actually saying that, madness or insanity had, a bit more of a charm in the prior civilization than the so-called, humane world we live in, or at least the modern world in his time. Where you have the clinician now who steps in and must make judgments out of constructed norms towards whether a person is mad or not. And in some regards, I think he's right in how there was a certain reverence for eccentricism across Europe, and certainly if you again contrast to Deleuze and creativity, writing the deterritorializations, if you will, or that sort of process, of course, requires someone a little bit mad, or at least shamanic enough, if you will, in that analogy, really, to break off from the herd. And of course, that requires a bit of madness, or at least to break away from the normative concepts of that day. And so in many regards, there's actually a compelling point to be made that madness was treated more dignified in the past. But without pressing too far onto this now, we could see perhaps in his early works that you're dealing with a sort of archaeology of these concepts, these ideas of power and madness, eventually it's going to flip to a sort of Nietzschean genealogy of power. Of course, Nietzsche did the genealogy of morals. Foucault is going to be interested in power and how that plays with ethics. But at the midway point in his career, there's a sort of second ambition that, of course, focuses on power in an epistemological sense. And so the focus of the order of things and how human knowledge is obtained. And so now I want to dig into that text. I think it's from 1966. And so in the order of things really is an examination of the breaking down and really the changes of soft sciences as it modified itself into the modern world. And there's a couple of disciplines that he's really focused on, and that's, of course, economics, linguistics, and biology. And so he's looking at, those paradigms, those truths, and how they are social constructions. And so if you could perhaps, look at all these changes within a discipline, we could perhaps understand how, these soft sciences, become, and we'll have a richer understanding out of that, or at least that's how I think Foucault is trying to lend us to thinking about these things. And so in discussing construction and deconstruction of these soft sciences in really the last 500 years or so, he really puts these into four different epistemes or epochs, if you will, of knowledge. And so these epistemological Kuhnian paradigms, if you will, is reminiscent of, again, with Deleuze and the sort of royal sciences and going against nomadic intensities, if you will. There's a sort of amalgamation of epistemological knowledge within a science, or within these epistemes, if you will. And even when there's something outside of it, ultimately it still gets totalized, even if it's such a contrast, until of course there's a sort of change. But for Foucault, and this is of course very important to point out, any of these changes or transformations are quite arbitrary to Foucault. And so this is, again, why he's a post-structuralist and not an actual structuralist. A Hegelian or a structuralist would say that, those changes were ultimately necessary in, progress and in an evolutionary sense, and that we are evolving through these sort of epistemes. Jean Gebser comes to mind with, those conscious structures, which it is kind of interesting how, Gebser is a really late modern thinker and an admirer, even though he's in this sort of same era. And so one of the things you could perhaps see him pick up on is, of course, that in his conscious structures there's also never really a causal way, similar to how Foucault sees this in an interesting way, that there's no formalization of these rules for how one episteme or one paradigm, if you will, starts or finishes. There's no logical or structural reasoning or rationality for the holistic view of human thought developing, which of course is way different than people like Hegel and the prior generations. This is a huge difference that I think is worth considering. And so it is in principle for Foucault arbitrary, and these changes cannot be reconciled for why exactly they happen in these different fields such as biology or economics. And so in these epistemes, you have really this Renaissance period until about 1650, and really the episteme there is taking causal qualities between different categories and relating them. It's based on analogy, really. How different structures or different identifiers or signals relate to each other, and how you could logically base that and cut that off. And then, of course, you have the start of the Enlightenment, which, again, there's no causal reason for why analogy is insufficient for the Enlightenment, if you will. And then, of course, you get to modernity, which is about up to mid-19th century. And so after that, of course, you get Foucault's era with postmodernity. And so until about 1950, with the birth of postmodernity, which he's writing in, there's a totalizing narrative or totalizing story that gives legitimacy to all of our forms of politics, of ethics, of quite literally being in the world. And so everything has a sort of reference. You can perhaps see how you go from analogy to totalizing narratives of referring back to these different disciplines, and how you can synthesize them. And so you're creating a totalized meta-narrative of modernity. And so this concept idealizes the need for this overarching theme that runs through all of human life and thinking. A good example for this is, of course, in the social sciences with the influence of Marxism. You have this explanation for historical contingency with material relations and class production that really subsumes the entire field for centuries now. That goes back to this Marxist lens, and of course Foucault is another instantiation really of Marxism and this historical contingency. These narratives of the modern world that really look to systematize everything. And then, of course, the postmodern phase starts at about 1950, and this is, of course, the end of being, the end of these narratives, because, of course, nobody believes in a sort of totalizing narrative after World War II. And so there can't really be any legitimacy for any of these cross-pollinations of ethics, politics, human knowledge, because once one narrative collapsed in a sort of totalizing arborescent form, to use Deleuze again, you're really poisoning the entire well. If there's a sort of cross-reference here to this total narrative, then you need it to function on all fronts. Otherwise, it all falls apart. And so Foucault is actually going to radically state that we can't actually have this kind of knowledge in postmodernity anymore, because being, or at least the narrative surrounding being, is taken away. So Foucault takes the categories really of thought in that sort of subjective grid, if you will, with the likes of the Dasein, or another way might be this sort of a priori, the preconditions to thinking or being in a sort of cultural experience. And there's a sort of historical contingency, though, with that, where one's place and time. But of course, with Foucault, again, he's saying that this is ultimately arbitrary, that your preconditions, yes, they are there and they are historically contingent, but the way they shift is arbitrary. Again, this is a deep-seated nihilistic philosophy and philosopher that we are unpacking here, that goes without saying. And so we do not have a fixed, universal, a priori understanding, but one that relies on the arbitrary way in which we construct and deconstruct the social. And so the understanding of the world could be truthful and not relativized, at least in the modern way of understanding this. Foucault's trying to say, modernity tries to act like, there is this sort of, truth, the aletheia, if you will, to be revealed. But we also understand that, we're, placed in certain contingencies, certain matters of fact that only affect people in a certain place and time. But that applies, of course, to our ability to find truth, despite this historicism. And Foucault's going to say you can't really do this. This is one of the paradoxes of modernity, and leads to really the collapse of it. And so he's going to radically state, that we must abolish man, or end being in all of its ways of knowledge before. In other words, at least in the history of ideas, he's saying, we have to do away with foundationalism, or a sort of rational basis for politics, which, underlay man being in the world. You can't have it both ways, as it were. And so, to reiterate, the archaeology of knowledge, or at least the text for it, has the ambition of looking at the gaps, and builds really on how the order of things in his epistemological project plays into these gaps between these paradigms. It's kind of a play on the Deleuzian intensity again, in the relationship to the royal sciences that pick apart a paradigm. But continuing on these different projects here that I wanted to point out in his introduction, the third project, and really the works on sexuality and its 3 volumes, really is a focus actually on his ethical thinking and living with technologies of this, and how we actually develop ourselves, and how we can use desire, a way to really bring out freedom, if you will. And so his philosophy, as we'll go on, is really a history of concepts, but he's not just looking at it from this is the past and this was how it used to be, but he's drawing a lineage, a genealogy, if you will, of these processes, and ultimately the way those processes, may have happened historically and made them contingent, plays into, the present world you live in this gradual construction of ourselves and our institutions. He's going to really set forth that, certainly in power and looking at punishment, there's this, naturalist notion of, things being the way they are, and complements to the natural order, the way it speaks to us, something, hierarchical, if you will, that's, given sort of natural reason or category for how it, goes about its own processes. Foucault is going to, of course, reject this and, say that, there is a constructive and deconstructive process actually going on when you consider, something being natural, like capitalist hierarchies and wealth inequality, if you will. And so he's going to say, human freedom really comes into a sort of battle with the natural world, because of course there's desire and the freeing up of it is always restricted by the natural world, and these arguments that say this is just the way it is because that's how the natural world is. Foucault is allergic to that, quite literally, and so by socially constructing something like madness, we're imposing coercion on these discourses between what is acceptable and not under power dynamics. And so if we're going to then look at how madness really comes about in its categorization, there really is no discourse, as we talked earlier about eccentrics, for madness in prior society. Ultimately, it was really the utilitarian, at least for Foucault, who comes in and requires the removal or the segregation of the mad for the greater social utility. Madness in its discourses is actually an example of Enlightenment thinking, and you won't find that in the Renaissance. So again, you're seeing a transformation here to the concept of madness. Foucault, in a sense, is actually trying to warn us that reason and enlightenment and the humanities, if you will, is actually a soft power construction that is put into the modern world. And so in its shifts to all these different epistemes, you have rules of formation in a given place and time in history. And so this methodology lends to tools to understanding how this plays into sort of canon and how we look at power relations. And so as we shift here to the concept of madness and the concept of punishment, Foucault gives a really nasty description of how executions and punishment had been done in prior society, but he's going to say that we've actually seen a morphology here to one of discipline, from the body to the soul. But I think I want to stop here now for the sake of this video getting on too long. I've kind of become more aware lately that a lot of these uploads have gone very lengthy, and so I want to perhaps cut back and try to get back to the the kind of medium form. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the somewhat scattered introduction to Foucault's ambitions and different projects over the span of his rather lengthy academic career, despite obvious transgressions, if you will, behind the scenes that made his life considerably shorter. He was a prolific writer, after all. And so, yeah, if you guys like this video and want to see more, I hope you like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you for our History of Madness video.